Dr. Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. You've helped redefine what's possible in carbon recycling. I'd love to explore how circular technologies are reshaping industrial value chains.
Absolutely. I think the basic concept around carbon recycling is an acceptance that carbon is precious and it cannot and should not be thrown away. But instead, what we want to do is change from this linear economy where we convert carbon into emissions or we convert into plastics that we throw away, and instead we put it back into the cycle. So take that carbon emission, capture that carbon, and turn it into something else. So you're doing it over and over again rather than throwing it away.
So you're redefining, reusing, recycling.
Yes. Yes, it's really reusing carbon. And actually, a lot of people like to think about energy efficiency, right? All we're talking about is carbon efficiency. How do we minimize the use of fresh carbon?
That's really interesting. How would you then say that the perception of carbon recycling, how has that changed in the past decade?
Well, first of all, I don't think people were even saying carbon recycling. They would just say recycling. And so the fact that people are now talking about a circular carbon economy, not just a circular economy, tells you we've come a long ways. It is now blending into the concept of CCU, carbon capture and reuse. And so carbon recycling, carbon reuse, these are all important elements of an economy that values carbon.
And that's really important, isn't it? Which industries would you say are showing the strongest traction for circular technologies?
Well, we work with steel mills and ferroalloy plants a lot, and so I'm seeing a lot of traction there. The steel industry is under a lot of pressure to decarbonize, and so they're thinking of new ways of doing it. So we get a lot of traction. I think refining is starting to move along. Refining has always focused on sequestration, not reuse. But now more and more, especially in the Middle East, you see people saying, wait a second, why am I going to take money to bury it in the ground? Why not reuse it? And so you're starting to see an evolution in thinking.
Is the steel industry making rapid leaps and bounds because are they manufacturing the most, or are they causing or creating the most? Is that the reason that industry is so far ahead?
That's a great question, actually. Yes, that is an industry that emits a lot of carbon by definition. But I also think, in every industry that wants to create change, at the beginning, there has to be leaders. There has to be people that appreciate that a change has to happen before legislation comes along, before somebody says this is a problem. So I think the concept of greening steel is something that is further ahead than greening cement or greening refining. I think it's just been an industry that has had some great leaders.
I really like that term, greening steel, because actually that makes a lot of sense. How do you scale circular innovation from pilot to commercial? How does that work?
Well, it depends. I mean, in our industry, we're a process, right? So we have to take many steps, right? Lab, pilot, demo, commercial. And then even when you build your first commercial, your first of a kind, you've got to remember that isn't going to be the most cost competitive. Remember when solar was so expensive? Now, it's everywhere. It's the same thing with cell phones and everything else. You have to drive them down the cost curve. And the only way to do that is to build more and more and more. And so I think a lot of people focus too much on the first of a kind. To me, the first of a kind is more of a technical proof point. You also need to then get to the commercial and the economic proof points, which come a little later.
And how do you do that? How do you go from the...
You just build, I think the more you build, when you build your first one, you need it to work. And to make it work, you add belts and suspenders, right? That makes it expensive. That makes it a very high capital project. And so the more you build, the more you simplify. Because the more you know, the easier it is to reduce the cost. And the way you do that is you just simplify. Do I really need that piece of equipment? Do I need that pump? Sometimes the answer is no. Let's just move on and make it cheaper.
Wise words. What would you say then is the missing link between policy, markets, and technology?
Yeah, I think often the problem with legislation is that it favors incumbents. It favors what is known. Legislation seldom leans into what is possible. With technology, you're always looking into the future. Legislation seldom looks into the future. So technology neutrality is very important in legislation, but very few bits of legislation are technology neutral. And the reason for that is one always worries about unintended consequences with legislation. But I'm afraid that if we don't move more quickly, legislation stops being an enabler and actually becomes something that slows you down. It's a cause for inaction because the new ideas are not just not getting support, but they're being slowed down.
But do you not think it's important, though, to have that legislation, to enforce it, to actually make it work, to make it happen?
Yeah, you do need legislation to make it work because, like I said, the first ones are more expensive. And so acceptance and support are critical. And you see that we were talking about India earlier, you and I. In India, they have viability gap funding. In Europe, they have innovation funding, the innovation fund. These kinds of things help first of a kind get a foot out the door.
Speaking of foot out of the door, what partnerships excite you the most? What new partnerships excite you the most?
Well, one of the partnerships I'm most excited about is a partnership with IFC. We're going to be working with them to try to see if we can do a project here in Oman. And I'm very excited about the partnership because what they enable us to do is to think ahead. If the project is feasible, they will be part of the infrastructure funding. If they're part of the infrastructure funding, we can move more quickly. One of the things we have tried to do is work with people like Brookfield and now IFC to make it easier once you get to FID to actually build the plant. Because if you don't get started on getting the financing until after you've gotten it to the final investment decision, it just slows you down.
I'm going to ask you some additional questions. Is there one product that we'll see made from recycled carbon soon?
One product. We focused on two types of things. There are the mandated markets like sustainable aviation fuel or marine fuel. And I think there recycled carbon will become extremely important. And that's also a place where legislation has caught up. Recycled carbon fuels as part of the European directive and the UK's directives as well. And so this is a place where definitely we will go. But I'm a big fan of the voluntary markets as well. At the end of the day, carbon is an essential part of all materials. So if you go to crag hoppers, for example, which I'm sure you know from your UK background, their CO2 renew collection, that polyester has been made from recycled carbon emissions. And that is something that we provide the emissions-derived feedstock. I'm very excited about these things finally becoming real and having people be able to just go buy something.
It's soon becoming a reality. Then do you think, therefore, then that the market will adopt faster than we expected?
I find that everything moves at a certain pace, right? I think it feels like nothing's happening and then it just goes. I think we're multiple years away from the market really taking off. But when it does, you're right, it will surprise you how fast it will go.
Finally, what would you say is the one misunderstanding that people have about carbon recycling?
I think the biggest misunderstanding is that it will become economic. I think a lot of people don't expect it to. They think this will always be very expensive. But I think the more we build, the cheaper it will get. So I think the economics will follow.
That's great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.